or centralization of power as a massive threat to liberty. Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the Fast Friday edition of the show for March 29th, 2024. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the show, and on this episode, I've got my top 10 favorite quotes from the founders and old revolutionaries warning about the dangers of consolidation or centralization of power, plus a few bonus quotes on the debate over whether the Constitution would actually lead to a consolidated system or not. But first, a quick background point. It's essential to understand the fact that the founding generation had just fought a long, bloody war to get away from the unlimited centralized power of the British, which was mostly expressed in the Declaratory Act of 1766, claiming power over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The old revolutionaries cited this over and over and over as the root cause. I've covered that in some detail in an episode, which will be linked to in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty with some other interesting information along with all the original source documents. Alan Mosley will get that organized and I'll have it published at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty a couple hours after this live stream is done. And that'll include, for example, this letter from Thomas Jefferson to Joseph C. Cabell. He said, "What has destroyed liberty in every government which has ever existed under the sun? The generalizing and concentrating of all cares and power into one body." Now, Jefferson certainly understood what it was like to live under the largest government in history at the time, and now we're also living under the largest government in history once again. And because the old revolutionaries spent so much of their time resisting and opposing unlimited centralized power, it's no surprise that many of the people who were in the ratification debates who had gone through this firsthand were so opposed to the idea of consolidation. Like William Grayson, an anti-federalist in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, he was pretty prominent during the Revolution in Virginia. He was on early committees of correspondence there before the war started. And then during the war, he was a lieutenant colonel. He led a regiment of troops. He was there at Valley Forge. He was an aide-de-camp to George Washington, a lot more. But anyways, here's how he put it. The idea of consolidation is abhorrent to the people of this country. That's what they had escaped. Recreating it was just, well, shooting yourself in the foot, I guess. Patrick Henry, who hammered on consolidation over and over and over in his many speeches during the Virginia Ratification Convention, on June 7th, he said, "Dangers are to be apprehended in whatever manner we proceed, but those of a consolidation are the most destructive." Everyone, well, minus the Hamiltonians, really agreed that consolidation was a problem. And we'll get to it in a moment. It was just whether or not this system would lead to the type of consolidation that would be dangerous. But no one really spent a lot of time explaining why consolidation was a problem. Well, not no one. Brutus, in his great first anti-federalist essay, really went through some detail as to why. I've got a whole episode on this that'll be linked to in the show notes. But basically, here's the main points. The more centralized the state, the more it's going to lead to an abuse of power, the more it's going to lead to law being really just the will of the people in power. Because everything comes from the center, just like we have today, you're going to have tons of factions and infighting, just trying to control the whole system. You're going to have a government of coercion and force, and maybe even standing armies to try to force the will of the people in power. So that is covered in more detail in this episode, The Dangers of Consolidation, which will be linked to in the show notes. Now, Samuel Adams made a very important observation in this letter to Elbridge Gerry in 1789, recognizing that consolidation was a greater problem or a huge problem when you have people who have different viewpoints, because then it just requires violence to force your way. And he didn't get into that, but that's really where you go with this. He said, I think really he's hinting at that. "I am fully persuaded that the people of the United States, being in different climates, of different education and manners, and possessed of different habits and feelings, under one consolidated government, cannot long remain free or indeed under any kind of government but despotism. So in other words, you can have a very diverse society as long as you are very much decentralized. The more diverse you have in your views on religion, culture, society, politics, economics, whatever it may be, the more you have diversity in that, the more dangerous it is to have a centralized state. And that's why we have huge problems today under the largest government in history. John Lansing in the New York Ratifying Convention put it this way: a consolidated government could not preserve the essential rights and liberties of the people. And Patrick Henry hammered it home with this: consolidation must end in the destruction of our liberties. I'm going to get to some Federalists during the ratification debates in just a moment, but I wanted to point to George Washington. In his farewell address, he addressed consolidation as well, but under the idea of the spirit of encroachment. This is a recognition that people with power tend to just always try to expand their power. And this is what's called a spirit of encroachment. People who have power in the executive branch may want to do stuff that has been properly delegated to the legislative branch, or vice versa. And then maybe all of the branches in Washington, D.C. might want to encroach on the powers that were reserved to the states or to the people. And that spirit of encroachment, George Washington warned, tends to consolidate the powers of all the departments in one, and thus to create whatever the form of government, a real despotism. That's Washington's farewell address, first drafted by James Madison in 1792, reworked by Hamilton, both under Washington's guidance in 1796. Now back to the ratification debates. A leading Federalist, William Davie in North Carolina, recognizing all this, points out that so extensive a country as this can never be managed by one consolidated government. Davie was one of the big government guys of the time. Now compare that to what we have today, and he sounds better than almost anyone around. Fisher Ames was also another big government guy in Massachusetts, but he pointed out that too much provision cannot be made against a consolidation. And one more from the Federalists here. James Wilson, maybe one of the leading Federalists, one of the most influential, also was one of the first Supreme Court Associate Justices. Here he is in the ratification debates in Pennsylvania, said, to support with vigor a single government over the whole extent of the United States would demand a system of the most unqualified and the most unremitted despotism. Now, just taking this in a vacuum, without the context of what he was talking about, sure sounds like, well, Wilson and Samuel Adams absolutely agreed completely on consolidation. But Wilson was including a caveat here. He's basically saying, yeah, I agree if we had a consolidated system, but we're not creating a totally consolidated system, a single government with decision-making over anything. We're only aiming for a partial consolidation. And that is really the argument that we heard over and over and over from many of the Federalists, here from James Wilson and many others after. But even before this, James Madison, before the Philadelphia Convention started, he wrote to George Washington and a few other people with this same kind of a message. And here he is to Washington in April of 1787. He said, conceiving that an individual independence of the states is utterly irreconcilable with their aggregate sovereignty, and that a consolidation of the whole into one simple republic would be as inexpedient as it is unattainable, I have sought for some middle ground, which may at once support a due supremacy of the national authority and not exclude the local authorities wherever they can be subordinately useful. So Madison was definitely looking for a much more centralized system than what they came up with in Philadelphia. Now, he didn't try to scam people into getting it anyways, I think, like Hamilton did, but he certainly was recognizing that the people weren't going to accept a totally consolidated system, even though I think he was actually on board with that. Now, here's Madison and Hamilton again in Federalist 19, pointing out that they were only going for a proper consolidation. So you could have some consolidation, you just had to do it the right way, and then everything would be cool. Now, Anti-Federalists weren't buying that. But here's Alexander Hamilton again. In Federalist number 32, he said, the plan of the convention aims only at a partial union or partial consolidation. And here's Brutus in his first paper again. He's recognizing that this is what they're being told. He knew they weren't trying to create a completely consolidated system. So some of the arguments in response, it's almost as if they're ignoring what Brutus was saying and some of the others, Cato and others, because they weren't arguing that the system in and of itself, what was put down on paper, was intending to create a single government over the whole country, but they just thought over time it would create a giant centralized state. Here's how Brutus put it. Although the government reported by the convention does not go to a perfect and entire consolidation, it approaches so near to it that it must, if executed, certainly and infallibly terminate in it. Patrick Henry, on the 7th of June the following year in Virginia, he said, this, sir, again, I don't think he's even taking the same position as Brutus here, that it's really so close that it's going to end up that way. Patrick Henry's pointing out that over time, and many of the anti-federalists said, well, you've got all these undefined powers, poorly defined things like general welfare and necessary and proper. And over time, people with power are going to read these in ways to expand their power. And of course, it's going to end up as a consolidated monster. And I think they called it. He said, this, sir, must naturally terminate in a consolidation. If this will do for other people, it will never do for me. Or Richard Henry Lee in a letter to Patrick Henry in 1789, after the government was already in operation. Of course, they were discussing potential amendments to deal with this thing. And Richard Henry Lee said, the most essential danger from the present system arises from its tendency to a consolidated government. So again, they weren't saying that, okay, you guys are just lying to us. What you've really created was a totally consolidated system, and you're just pretending that it's not. No, they're agreeing on the anti-federalist side. They're repeatedly agreeing, yeah, okay, we know what you're telling us you're trying to create, but we disagree that it's going to end up that way. And that was Richard Henry Lee, federal farmer, in his first anti-federalist letter to probably Governor Clinton is who we are assuming it was written to. This is in October of 1787. He actually makes the case. He takes the position that this was intentional. They just put it on paper to look pretty decent, but some of them really wanted to just try to establish a system that they could expand power anyways, and I think he was right for some of them, the Hamiltonians, of course. He said, the plan of government now proposed is evidently calculated totally to change in time our condition as a people. Instead of being 13 republics under a federal head, it is clearly designed to make us one consolidated government. This consolidation of the states has been the object of several men in this country for some time past. So he recognized that some people wanted to do this, and they certainly were making an effort to do so. I think I have one other one from him. No, maybe not. James Madison, I think, really makes just an important point, though. He's arguing, of course, with Patrick Henry in the Virginia ratification debates. This is in June 6, 1788, also with George Mason. And he's saying, no, this is a partial consolidation. But if we did this, it would be totally consolidated. And of course, this would be a huge problem. Check it out. Had the government been completely consolidated, the Senate would have been chosen by the people in their individual capacity in the same manner as the members of the other house. Now, of course, that was more than a century before the 17th Amendment, but James Madison, basically, it was just one step away from being completely consolidated. I think some people who are more honest about what they were trying to do and saying, look, we don't want a totally consolidated system, but we need some consolidation. They really believed that they could pull off this kind of high wire act. And others on the anti-federalist side were saying, no, not a chance. But here's Madison himself pointing out, like, look, if the bulwark against having a totally consolidated system was making sure that the people in the Senate represented the states and not the people in the states, as it is in the House of Representatives. And I think we're very, very close to that, if not exactly there, after passage of the 17th Amendment. Well, anyways, I hope you found this interesting. I hope it was educational. More important than anything, I hope you learned something. I hope it made you think. If you want to help us get this kind of message out, this important historical information, foundational principles out to more and more people, absolutely nothing helps us roll up our sleeves every single day and do this kind of work more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way. 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. There's also annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. No pressure, but I'd be very grateful for any consideration you can give to joining us today at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. I hope you had a great week. I hope you have an awesome weekend, a very happy Easter, whatever you may be doing. And I look forward to seeing you here next week on the path to liberty.